as the title of the webinar alludes to, we'll be focusing specifically on the preferences window in EndNote 20. Specifically, in this session, I'll be using EndNote 20 for Windows, but I will point out any differences between the preferences window on Mac OS or Microsoft Windows. And today, we're just going to be reviewing, it's an overview of all of the various tabs found on the EndNote preferences window in EndNote 20. We'll be looking at first the change case tab. These are all of the preferences related to terms that you would not want EndNote to change the capitalization of, things like proper nouns, acronyms, initialism, things like that. I'll show that in action. We'll look at the display fields tab. You've got 10 optional display fields that you can include within your reference list panel on your library window to display various bits of metadata directly on the library interface. And again, I'll show you how you can configure those various pieces of information from the display fields tab. We've got the display fonts tab next that we'll take a look at. Basically, this controls the appearance of the EndNote interface and the size of the text. This aspect of the application has been redesigned, sort of streamlined in EndNote 20. Very straightforward application that we have here in the new version of EndNote, so we'll cover that quickly. We'll look at the duplicates tab next. These are all of the settings related to EndNote's find duplicate search. You have the ability in EndNote Desktop to reconfigure the comparison fields that you have EndNote look at when determining duplicate references, up to 17 various comparison fields in EndNote 20. I'll show you how you can reconfigure those if you'd like. There's also an optional setting of whether or not you want to have EndNote find exact matches, or if you would want EndNote to ignore things like punctuation and other characters such as that. So we'll look at how you can customize your find full text preferences if desired. We'll look at the find full text tab next. This is all of the settings related to the find full text search available in EndNote Desktop, the feature that allows EndNote to go out onto the web to try to locate full text articles for you to download automatically. And you've got some flexibility in regard to which sources find full text will attempt to query. And if you're at an institution that might have subscription access to various articles, there's a couple of institution-specific bits of information that you can add to this location on the preferences window so that you can expand EndNote, what EndNote can connect with and possibly improve your overall success rate when performing a find full text search. We'll look at the folder locations tab. This is the pieces of information where you would tell EndNote where to look for custom content files that you may have either downloaded from our website or maybe received custom, let's say, output style from a colleague or a co-author. And I'll show you how you can reconfigure this preference if desired and where these custom content files usually live by default on your hard drive. We'll look at the formatting tab next. These are a couple of various settings, primarily related to how, cite while you write would format individual in-text citations. There is a legacy setting here pertaining to the old feature called format paper, but lesser used feature now that, we've got the cite while you write add-in for Microsoft Word, but I'll be sure to point those out, and if we've got time, I'll show you those features in action. We can toggle the setting off and on to sort of take a look at how it would function in the real world, depending on how you've configured these settings. We'll look at the libraries tab next. This is basically just the setting related to how you would want EndNote to launch, whether you have EndNote launch with the default setting of open the most recently used library, whatever library you had open during your last session. There are some other settings related to this location on preferences as well. You can do things like have EndNote always prompt you to select a library when you launch the application, or perhaps do nothing and perhaps just take you to the background window when the application launches so that you'll have full control over what you do next. So this is a pretty straightforward aspect of the preferences interface. We'll look at the PDF handling tab after that. You've got the ability to rename PDFs if you'd like. By default, EndNote will not do that and just attach your PDFs with whatever name they currently exist with at the time of attaching those files. But you do have the ability from the PDF handling tab to select up to 3 fields in your EndNote library records that EndNote would look at and draw from if you wanted EndNote to automatically rename your attachments so that you've got some consistency to the naming convention of these resources that you're linking to your library references. Not everyone's looking to do that, but it's nice to have this flexibility. And on this PDF handling tab, you've got the ability to set what we call a PDF auto import folder. If you're regularly coming across PDF articles during your discovery process or discovery phase, you can define a folder where you save these PDFs, and then periodically EndNote will try to import those PDFs into your EndNote library so that EndNote not only attaches the PDF to an entry in your library, but will actually try to make a new entry in your library for those particular articles, depending on whether or not EndNote can locate a DOI number in any of those PDFs that you're importing, and we'll take a look at that in action. We'll look at the read or unread status tab. This is essentially a sort of a legacy feature in EndNote that has taken a sort of a back seat in EndNote 20. Not everyone's looking to identify whether or not they've handled a particular reference, perhaps gone into it to read all of the underlying metadata. It's still something that's present. It's not necessarily turned on by default, but again, I'll show you how you can enable that functionality if you'd like, and sort of see it in action if you might find it beneficial, again, to mark a reference as read to let you know that you've handled it versus unread, an item that you might not have taken a look at yet. We'll look at the reference types tab. This is the aspect of the EndNote preferences where you can do things like define your default reference type when you're manually adding a reference, which reference type will come up automatically. Journal article is the default reference type by default, but you can change that. This is also the location of the preferences where you can redefine your reference types. That goes a little bit outside of the intent of this particular lesson plan, but I'll show you the interface where, again, you can add fields, remove fields, relabel fields, create new reference types if you'd like. I'll give you a preview of that interface in the application. And then once you've customized your reference types, you have the ability to export those to an XML file so that you can import those custom reference types onto a different computer if you happen to use EndNote on more than one computer, or if you have a colleague or a co-author and you want to make sure that that person has all of the customizations available that you've created related to your reference types, you can provide your colleague your custom XML file containing your reference types, and then that person can import those customizations into their copy of EndNote as well. So some flexibility with regard to how you're defining the reference types that exist in your EndNote application. We'll look at next the sorting tab. This is essentially a location on the preferences window where you can define terms or letters, perhaps, that start author names, perhaps surnames, compound surnames, or titles, let's say. If you've got a title that starts with a, an, or the, you might want EndNote to ignore that particular term and sort the title, the reference, based on the second word in the title. So again, you've got some flexibility with regard to how EndNote's sorting, references in your bibliographies. I'll show you how you can configure those preferences. We'll look at the sync tab after that, or excuse me, we'll look at the spell check tab after that. As you can note, that's a Windows-only preference. It doesn't mean that EndNote for macOS doesn't have spell check, but on macOS, EndNote is using the spell checker that's built into the operating system. On Windows, we're still relying on technology from a company called Wintertree to provide spell check functionality in EndNote 20 for Microsoft Windows. Once we've taken a look at that, we'll look at the sync tab. That's the feature that allows EndNote to coordinate the contents of a particular library with a free EndNote Online account so that you can then use that account to coordinate the contents of your references on more than one computer if you'd like. Let's say you install EndNote on a laptop and a desktop. With the sync feature, you don't have to move your library manually back and forth between those two computers. You can just define a synced library on both of those machines, and the sync feature in the EndNote desktop application would work automatically behind the scenes to make sure that the contents of that library was the same in either of those locations. So again, we'll review the sync tab and how to set up the sync feature. We'll look at the temporary citations tab. This is basically a a temporary citation is a placeholder citation in your Word documents or your writing projects, and you do have some flexibility with regard to how those temporary citations appear in terms of their default format. Something not many people are doing. That's very a power user feature, I'd say for sure. But we'll go over all of those settings so that if you might want to incorporate this functionality in your EndNote usage, you would be able to do so. And then closing out, we're going to take a quick look at the term lists tab. Again, this is an aspect of the EndNote application that's worthy of an entire lesson of its own, but there are a couple of preferences related to term lists and how they're populated that you'll find on EndNote's preferences window. I'll show you how to configure those settings. And then finally, we'll close out with an overview of what's called the URLs and links tab. There are some various settings here related to whether or not you're developing a connect log file, which records information or communication between EndNote and a remote database when you're using the online search feature. This is also where you can define your open URL arguments. If your organization or your institution employs an open URL server, you've got some control over how those queries are formed. Typically, the default arguments are fine, but again, nice to know where you've got the flexibility to redefine the arguments if necessary. And this is also where you would control whether or not EndNote is making a relative link to your file attachments. That's the default functionality where EndNote will copy the file wherever it originally exists and place the version that EndNote accesses within your library's data folder, or if EndNote is making what's called an absolute link. If you turn off that default functionality and instead instruct EndNote to make an absolute link, that's just going to generate a pointer to a particular file. This gives you control over, the structure of your file attachments on your hard drive, but it can make it tricky to move your library from one computer to another. And again, we're going to go over each one of these points in more detail once we dive into the application, which I think we're ready to do now. So now that we've read through the agenda items here, I'm going to go ahead and just minimize my slide deck, and we're just going to dive right into the EndNote application here. You can see that I've already got a library open. This is the sample library in the EndNote 20 application. And for me to access the preferences interface with EndNote 20 for Microsoft Windows, I'm going to go to the Edit drop-down menu. This is where we see the last menu item is Preferences. Before I bring this up, if anyone on the line or attending the webinar today is on Mac OS, you're actually going to find a separate EndNote 20 drop-down menu in the top left of your screen, and that's where you'll find the Preferences command for EndNote Desktop on Mac OS. So just to reiterate, if you're on Windows, it's here on the Edit drop-down where you'll find Preferences. If you're on Mac OS, there's a separate EndNote 20 drop-down, and that's where you would choose Preferences. I'm going to go and click on Preferences here from the Edit drop-down since I'm on Windows. And we're going to see that, the screen is broken down essentially to the same items that I just read through in terms of our agenda items. The first tab that we see on the left is Change Case. Again, this is the part of the interface, like I mentioned, where you can instruct EndNote to not change the case of particular terms. So if you think of things like, acronyms, equations, proper nouns, compound names, things like that that require consistent capitalization, you might not want EndNote to, override or overwrite with a separate title capitalization setting. So let's take a look at this in action. We see we've got a couple of defaults here, DNA and USA, but if I cancel off our preferences window just for a moment and go to a real basic Microsoft Word document that I've developed for our lesson here, we can see that I've cited a reference in this particular document where the title field contains the initialism CT, as in a CT scan. And we can see that I'm formatting this example document with the MLA output style, and I've actually got that style open for editing here. I just want to go ahead and bring that style up so that we can take a look at what's called the title capitalization setting here under bibliography. We see that I've selected title capitalization within the bibliography section. We've got 3 optional settings here. Most output styles, I would say, are set to leave titles as entered. That gives you the most flexibility with regard to your titles, and you would have sort of full control over how you want EndNote to format each word found in the title of each one of your references. But you'll find that some styles like MLA will have that overridden to ensure that, you know, there's a consistency applied to the title information in your cited references. So just to recap, the MLA style by default is set to apply a headline style capitalization to all titles. And if I just quickly return to our example Word document, we see that is taking place here. I've got consistency with regard to how my titles appear in this real basic bibliography. But the one negative aspect of this automated functionality in EndNote is that it's changed the case of capital C, capital T to just capital C, lowercase t, as if a CT was a word, you know, by itself, and that only the C needed to be capitalized. So for me to address this, I could go into my style itself, and I could change this to leave titles as entered. That way I would have control over how, you know, my titles are formatted. But if I do have, you know, pretty inconsistent titles in my EndNote library records, changing this to leave titles as entered might actually introduce more headaches than just a term here or there. So the other solution to have full appropriate capitalization for things like I was mentioning, acronyms or initialisms in your titles or authors, let's say, would be to add those terms to change case. So once more, back on my library window, I'm going to return to edit. I'll choose preferences here. We're back on change case. I'm going to go ahead and add CT as a term that I want EndNote to consider if it comes across to not change the case of this particular term. Now that it's defined here, I'll go ahead and just press add. We see that it becomes part of this list. I can go ahead and press, you know, apply on my preferences window, just so that I can see on the screen. This is something, the apply button is something you won't see on EndNote 20 preferences on Mac OS. There's just a save button that you would click on. So that's one minor difference between the two operating systems, is the appearance of whether or not that apply button is present on the preferences window. But now that I've you know, added my term and I've applied it to save the change, and I still want to leave this preferences window open for a moment, I can click OK at any point. Because I've made the change here, I'm going to go back to my example Word document, and whenever I'm ready, I'm just going to go ahead and press Update Citations in Bibliography, and all we should see that should take effect is the capitalization of CT should revert back to being fully capitalized, you know, as expected in my original title. So I'm going to go ahead and press this now. Perfect. We see that even though my MLA style is set to apply headline style capitalization to the titles in my bibliography, I've added the term CT as a entry on the change case tab on EndNote's preferences window, and EndNote, now that it comes across this term, knows that it shouldn't change the case of this particular initialism, and it's coming out fully capitalized in my bibliography. So again, this really, it's personal preference how you would, you know, combat or account for these particular terms. I would say the most flexible solution still is to just change the title capitalization of your output style to leave titles as entered. That way, EndNote will output your titles exactly how they're entered in your EndNote library records. But if you do want to, you know, apply one of these hard-coded capitalization options, headline style or sentence style, you can do so still in your output style. But on the EndNote preferences window, if you just add those particular terms to the change case tab, EndNote will no longer, again, alter or augment the capitalization when those terms are found in the title fields. So this can be really useful. Some users might not ever come across this, but again, if you've got things like proper nouns or initialisms or acronyms in your titles, this is definitely where this particular aspect of the preferences would come into play. Moving on, if we go to the title fields, the display fields tab, this is where, like I mentioned, you've got up to 10 possible display fields that you can configure so that they show up on what's called your reference list panel on your EndNote library window. If I just click OK on preferences just for a moment and return to the library window itself, the reference list panel is the sort of the primary panel that comprises the bulk of the library window itself. I can actually temporarily close my tabs panel here and give my reference list panel a little bit more screen real estate. You can see I've only got, maybe half a dozen display fields currently configured. If I want to change the display fields or maybe add an additional field, things like that, I can go back to the preferences window here on the edit dropdown. And then once we're on once we're on display fields, we see that I've got my currently defined fields listed here. I've got a couple of unused fields that are set to do not display. You can configure any one of these columns to set to show as do not display, so that there's not as much information if you prefer to devote more screen real estate to fewer bits of metadata. That's your choice. I can do things here like, let's say I want to add the indicator for the read or unread status. This is something we're going to talk about in just a little bit. I can click on the fields drop-down where I've got all of the different fields available in my EndNote library. There are a couple of items that are on this list that aren't necessarily fields per se. If I scroll down a little bit, we can see I've got, added to library or last updated. These aren't really fields in your EndNote library records. These are pieces of information tied to each one of your records, but these aren't actually fields that you can go type into. So I did want to mention that this fields dropdown does include some, identifiers, I guess you could say, or related information, and not necessarily a free text field that you can type into within your EndNote library record. If I scroll up, we've got the read or unread status at the top of this dropdown. That's the entry I want to add. Now, ultimately, I want this to be the first display column. It's not a requirement, but I'd say it makes it a little bit easier to spot if you choose to display the read or unread status at the beginning of the reference list panel. But instead of me defining this first and then manually moving each field down to the next column, I can actually add it like we see here under column 8. I can press OK. We see that it actually appears on the far right of this reference list panel, of course. That's the position of that particular column. But what I can do now is just drag and drop it into the desired position. Again, this is something I could have achieved by redefining all of the columns on the Display Fields tab. But if I define a field and return to my library window, I can quickly drag and drop it into position. And if we go back to the edit dropdown to choose preferences, we can see that that action that I've performed has automatically updated all of the columns, and I didn't have to go column by column to shift everything down. I was able to just drag and drop directly on the reference list panel to achieve that. Now we see, most of the fields that you select are the generic field names, and the heading that gets applied to it is the generic field name itself. Now that's usually fine. Typically you've got author information in the author field, you've got year information in the year field, title information in the title field. But I might want to do something like add, maybe I've got a typically unused field called label, and perhaps I'm adding a personal filing number to the label field, let's say. So, if I've got print materials, I can sort of use this as an identifier for myself to know where in my filing cabinet to find these resources. So here on the fields dropdown, if I want to display that information that I'll be adding, I would choose the generic field name of label, but instead of having the heading, the generic heading of label appear, I might want to replace that, since this field might be storing my personal filing number. I might want to have that label, that heading appear at the top of that column. So I've changed for label the heading of a personal filing number instead. And just to show you here quickly, if I press OK, all right, we see that this library does not yet have any information in the label field for any one of these references, but I've now configured this column to display so that as I start to add this information to my EndNote library records, I would be able to quickly see it directly on the library window. A couple of last points that I wanted to mention for this part of the preferences window. For most of the fields, it's a text heading that would appear, but there are a couple of fields that have specialized sort of symbol headings. We see that the read or unread status is sort of a filled-in circle. If you've got any references that have at least one file attachment, whether it be a PDF, a Word document, things like that, we see that that column is actually represented by a little paperclip icon. And I believe the final field that has a specialized symbol for a heading is the figure field. This is another sort of legacy feature in EndNote Desktop. You have the ability to store an image in your EndNote library records, and you can then generate a figure list in your Word document based off of these images stored in your EndNote library records. And whether or not any of your entries has a figure, you'll see a little icon appear within this particular column. I don't think this sample library has any figures. Let me just take a look here. Yeah, okay, just wanted to make sure. Yeah, no figures just yet. But if an entry did have a figure here, I would see a little indicator on this particular display column. I'm going to go ahead and go back to the edit dropdown, and I'm just going to go and undefine or remove figure. This is not a piece of information that we need to currently show here in this class. So I'm going to go ahead and set that to do not display, and if I press OK, perfect, we're back to the display columns that I do want to show here during our lesson. The last setting that I wanted to touch on for this particular aspect of the EndNote Desktop preferences is this checkbox at the bottom of the Display Fields tab. Old versions of EndNote, I'd say, maybe 15 or more years ago, in the author column on your EndNote library window, we would only show the first author's surname. And you can see I've just toggled that setting off so that EndNote is functioning as it used to, as sort of in its early years. And we see that we've got just one surname for each one of the library records. It does look a little nice. It's a little bit cleaner than otherwise, but sometimes it is important to be able to see the co-authors directly on your library window here. So that's, like I mentioned, added the option to display all authors within the author field. If I turn this back on just by checking this box here and I press OK, all right, we see that we've got additional information here in the author column. We see essentially all author names related to each EndNote library entry here. And the format of the author names will really depend on how the names were entered in the library itself. So depending on whether I've used, a first name space last name, or last name comma full first name or initials, that will influence how the names, the co-author names appear within your EndNote library's author field. So I did want to mention that. But again, gives you some flexibility with regard to whether or not you're showing only one name or if you're showing all names pertaining to a particular entry in your EndNote library. This is turned on by default, I did want to mention. Next on the preferences window, if we move on to display fonts, like I mentioned, this was reimagined or redesigned in EndNote 20 to be a little bit more streamlined or simplified, I guess you could say. In previous versions of EndNote Desktop, you would control the font and the size manually, and that could really leave you in a state where it could make EndNote, depending on the size of your screen and the settings that you've applied, make it very difficult to see. So this streamlined approach that we've taken here in EndNote 20 ensures that your EndNote interface is going to be, visible or legible on, extremely small screens or extremely large screens. We've got a lot of researchers who use TVs as their computer monitors, and so again, this it helps to ensure that whether you're on a a 7-inch screen or a 70-inch screen, that the EndNote interface is legible, and all of its elements are sort of in relation to all other elements of the library window. Currently, I've got the default size selected here. Just to quickly show this in action, I can change this to large instead, and if I press OK, and we're back on the library window, we see that the size of the font has increased, not only in the reference list panel, but the search panel, the groups panel. If I open up the tabs panel again, all of this has increased in size. So again, a streamlined approach to the display font in EndNote 20, but this definitely makes for a smoother experience regardless of the size of the screen that you're using when you're working with EndNote. Moving on to the duplicates tab here, we see that we've got, like I mentioned, various comparison fields that you have available to configure in EndNote Desktop. If anyone on the session is familiar with EndNote Online, find duplicates is a feature in EndNote Online as well, but you have no control over the fields that EndNote Online will compare when determining duplicates. EndNote Online will always consider the author, year, title, and reference type. Now, those are the same defaults in EndNote Desktop. If we look here, all of the default settings are applied. We see author, year, title are checked, If I scroll down a bit, we see reference type is checked as well. Usually that's precise enough to not end up with what we would call false positives. That would be, duplicate entries identified as duplicates that aren't truly duplicate references. But you might have, depending on the type of research you're tracking and citing, you might have some, ambiguous works that have the same author you're entitled. Let's say maybe you're citing sections of books or chapters of books where the overarching title is the same for each one of those chapters or sections. It's the chapter title that would be different. This default configuration in that scenario might still result in some, false positives, some items that aren't truly duplicates being marked as duplicate entries. And that might be an instance here where in that scenario, maybe you would want to add secondary title, which would look at, for book chapter references, the chapter title as well. I did want to point out, if I scroll down a little bit, we've got new in EndNote 20, 2 additional comparison fields that had not been previously selectable. We've got the ability to check for duplicates based on DOI information or PMCID information, which is typically stored in custom 2. Anyone could take advantage of these additional comparison fields. You'll probably find these are most beneficial for systematic review projects, but again, these might be beneficial comparison fields for other projects as well. I did want to point that out. I'm not going to change anything here. I'm going to leave it set as is. But again, if you wanted to, make the duplicate search a little bit more stringent, you can add additional comparison fields. Or if you're finding that it's a little bit too stringent and you want to loosen it up a bit, you can remove some of the comparison fields, and then you have control over, what EndNote is going to be sending to the trash as you're working through a find duplicate search. As I had mentioned when we were reviewing the agenda items, you do have in EndNote Desktop the ability to ask EndNote to ignore spacing and punctuation and just review the rest of the text in a particular comparison field, or you can ask for an exact match, including spacing and punctuation. As we saw, the default is to ignore spacing and punctuation. I'd usually recommend leaving this configured as is, but again, you've got full control over for personal preference. Now, there is a legacy setting here that we see at the very bottom of this tab. This really doesn't apply to EndNote 20. This is something that may be removed at some point going forward, but this was related to a concept in previous versions of EndNote Desktop called the modes toolbar, which would give you a little bit of control, I guess you would say, or options when it comes to performing an online search. There used to be an integrated search mode where if you performed an online search in the integrated search mode, you might capture references that you've already got in your library automatically. And so this option would help to ensure that you, if you did encounter a duplicate, that EndNote was moving that out of your library, not allowing you to capture a duplicate. In EndNote 20, you've just got one particular search mode where you would pick and choose which references it is that you're copying to your library, which would usually not result in duplicate references. So again, here in EndNote 20, this setting doesn't really come into play. I suspect this might be removed at some point going forward, but to help ensure compatibility with preferences across systems and versions of EndNote, we've left this setting for now. But again, in EndNote 20, this really doesn't come into play, this last setting here. I did want to mention that. Just checking the time here. It looks like we're making good time. We have about 55 minutes left. I just want to make sure I'm not spending too much time on any one of these particular tabs. But we're moving on now to the Find Duplicates tab. This is the feature in EndNote Desktop that allows EndNote to go out onto the web to try to find new articles for you to download. Let's actually take a look at this in action before we configure any of the preferences. If I press OK here, we would see that on my EndNote library window, I would be able to select a set of references. I can do this on a reference by reference basis, or I could select a batch of references, let's say. If I select a batch of references, I would usually recommend keeping your batches to 24 references or fewer. That is up to you. EndNote can actually search for, I think it's up to 200 references at a time when determining duplicate references. But it's usually safe, I would say, safest to keep your batches to do 24 or fewer references at a time for the resources that EndNote queries so that it doesn't look like bot activity to the information providers. But here I've just highlighted maybe about a dozen references on my EndNote library window. There are a couple of methods that you can use to initiate a find full text search, but I would say the most straightforward method here in EndNote 20 is this shortcut right on the EndNote library window. This little magnifying glass over a sheet of paper will trigger a find full text search. Let's keep an eye on my groups panel here. We see a heading called find full text. I'll actually collapse my group structure just for a moment to make the find full text section a little bit more visible. But whenever I'm ready, I can initiate the find full text search by clicking this icon here. There are 3 possible outcomes for a find full text search. While you see a searching label, this indicates that the search is still taking place. So we see I've got 6 references left, 5 references, it's just chugging along. We've got examples of all 3 outcomes, and I'll review those in just a moment. I want to make sure that this finishes before we start clicking around on the library window, just 1 reference left. And, I'd say the most straightforward, explanation or outcome from a find full text search is that EndNote finds a full text article for you to download. So we see it looks like I had, 9 references selected. And out of the 9 references, EndNote was able to find 3 articles for me automatically. Now, I don't have any specialized article access, subscription-based article access. I'm just relying on open access articles, so I'd say that this ratio is pretty realistic in terms of what you would probably find published in an open access format. But we see for these 3 entries in my EndNote library, each one has a little paperclip icon signifying that it's got at least 1 file attachment. The paperclip doesn't mean that it's a PDF. It could be a Word document or something like that. But again, if you're performing a find full text search, what would be downloaded would be a PDF if it's located. So we see here on the summary tab, I've got a little icon signifying my file attachment. And if I wanted to look at that, here it is in the PDF viewer in EndNote desktop. Just to confirm, this is a new PDF that EndNote was able to find on the web for me, download it to my library automatically, and save that change as well. So there's nothing extra I need to do to finalize the inclusion of these 3 articles. They're now part of my library unless I choose to delete them. For 2 of my 9 references, we see that EndNote was not able to find a PDF to download, but it did find a URL for the article. Typically, if we look at the Edit tab on the Tabs panel and scroll down to the URL field, usually that URL will point to the publisher's website. We see here for this particular article, it links to the journal Nature's website, and clicking on that link, you would usually have the option to purchase the article, possibly rent the article, depending on the publisher. If you have a standalone subscription with a publisher, you would usually have the ability to log on to this page or log in from this page and then be able to download that PDF perhaps manually at that point. But again, I did want to point that out. Now, if anyone is affiliated with a university and you might have access to a full text article through another service like an interlibrary loan, let's say, I wouldn't necessarily just go out and purchase something that comes up as found URL. Of course, that's something you can do, but you being affiliated with, let's say, the university in this scenario, you might have access to this article for free through some other system or service. So if something comes up as found URL, and you're affiliated with, let's say, a university or another institution that has a library, I would probably recommend reaching out to a local librarian just to confirm whether or not that would be an item that you would have access to through some other system or service, some other method. And then finally, the last outcome for a find full text search is just that nothing is found. And so in my example here, out of the 9 items that I searched for, 4 of these, and it was not able to find a PDF to download or a URL to add to these particular entries in my EndNote library. Now, if we return, now that we've seen find full text in action, if we return to the Edit dropdown to select Preferences once more, I think us performing that search will give these options a little bit more context. These are the default settings. Everything that we're looking at initially here are the default settings in EndNote 20. And so there are resources, several resources that are pre-configured that everyone would be able to possibly utilize. If you're a Web of Science subscriber and your institution has configured full text links in Web of Science, having this option marked while being IP authenticated can help increase your overall success rate when performing a find full text search, because again, EndNote would have an additional resource to query during this search activity. We see that DOI information is queried, and EndNote will utilize this for all articles. This is something, you wouldn't necessarily have to be at an organization with subscription access, but EndNote will utilize with DOI selected, utilize that information to try to find an article for you if it's published in an open access format. Again, EndNote will download that for you automatically and attach that to the EndNote library records. PubMed link out service is somewhat similar to the Web of Science full text links. PubMed has the ability to allow organizations to configure either their institutions or their publications to be compatible with PubMed's link out service. And if that is a resource, if you've got an item in your library that comports to that system in PubMed, again, this can be another resource that EndNote can query when looking for full text articles to download and help improve your overall success rate. Now we see that there's another option called Open URL that's marked. Not every institution employs Open URL technology. It's a technology that allows to coordinate full text article access or querying across multiple databases to sort of implement a standardization to that to, again, improve your overall success rate querying across multiple resources. So again, not every institution has an open URL server. Usually this is something you can ask to a librarian at your local library. If your organization doesn't have a library, you might reach out to your IT department. They may know whether or not your organization has access to an open URL server. If your organization does have an open URL server, you would be given something that looks like a web address to type into this field here. And this, again, would help when you're performing find full text searches, help to improve EndNote's overall success rate, because there would be an additional resource that EndNote can query when it was looking for full text articles. If you're at a larger institution, let's say at a university, you might have an authentication URL to input into the authenticate with field here. We've got a couple of examples of what these URLs would look like for various universities. And basically what this is just the start page for your institution. And with this URL defined within this authenticate with field here, once per find full text session, a browser window would pop up in the EndNote application to take you to that login page. And from that browser window, if you provide your institutional login credentials and successfully log in, during that instance of find full text searching, EndNote would be able to, again, query additional resources to improve your overall success rate. So, even with both of these fields defined here, if you're at an institution that has both an open URL server and an authentication URL, I wouldn't ever expect a 100% success rate from a find full text search. Not every institution, I would say, subscribes to every information provider's resource. So, even with everything fully populated here, I would, realistically probably only expect maybe 80% of resources to be located via a find full text search. If you have no institution-specific information to add to this window and you're relying on open access articles solely, it really depends on, your field of study and the date range of the items that you're querying. From what I understand, recently published research, again, depending on the field of study, you'll probably find between 25 and 40% of all published research published in this open access format. But again, really depends on your field of study and the time frame or the date range of the items that you're querying, whether or not you'll find an open access article to download automatically. Now, the last setting that I wanted to show in action here is that this checkbox at the bottom of this window, automatically invoke find full text on newly imported references. So this is, again, an optional setting. This is actually turned off by default. But if you're importing references from a text file, perhaps, and you want EndNote to automatically invoke find full text, instead of you selecting those references at a later time and clicking that shortcut like I showed to trigger the find full text search, you can actually have that search take place at the same time that these references are being imported into your library. So I've just marked this last option here, automatically invoke find full text on newly imported references. I've marked that. If I click OK on this window, I believe I have a sample PDF, or excuse me, a sample text file that we can try to import. Let me just take a look in my downloads folder here quickly. If not, I can create a new one if need be, but I believe we have some examples. Yes, we have a couple of examples here, one from PubMed and one from, I think, another information provider, perhaps Web of Science. But let's go and let's try to import the PubMed file here since it's smaller just due to time constraints. So I'm going to leave this File Explorer window open, but I'm going to return to my EndNote application. And back in EndNote here, if I want to initiate a text file import, I can go to the File drop-down menu. I can point my mouse over Import. This is unique on Windows. On Windows, you've got two submenu items, File, if it's a text file that you're importing, or Folder, if it's a folder of PDFs that you're importing. For Mac OS users, you have both of these options available to you, but on Mac OS, they're configurable from the same interface, the same screen in EndNote. On Microsoft Windows, these are broken down into two separate interfaces. So today I'm going to select File because it's a text file that we're trying to import. I need to choose that text file that we just located in my Downloads folder. So I'll press Choose. On this window here, I need to navigate to that folder. So I'll navigate to Downloads. That's where we had located my subfolder called Tag Text File Examples. And I've got two examples here. Again, it's the smaller one that we'll try just to due to time constraints. I've got that selected. I can click Open. I need to make sure that I choose the appropriate import option. EndNote library is the default, but this is not a library that we're importing. This is a text file. Specifically, it's coming from PubMed. So I need to make sure that I'm choosing the PubMed NLM import filter. I can select other filters from the import option dropdown. These are all of my import filters available in the EndNote application. Depending on the source of the text file that you're importing, that would dictate which import option you're selecting, which import filter. Again, the file that we're importing comes from PubMed, so I'm just going to go ahead and select that as my import option. Duplicates doesn't matter for this example. I don't think any of the references that I'm importing are duplicates, but you can see here that if I perhaps might have any duplicates, I could discard those automatically. I can import them into a separate duplicates library if need be. And for most of the time, I would say that text translation is set to no translation. It depends on your region where you're located and the language of the research materials that you're capturing. For most English language research, no translation would be selected. But if you're using a language or a character set that uses double byte characters, like let's say Cyrillic, that might be an instance where you need to choose the appropriate text translation option. These are English language references I'm importing, so no translation will be designated here. And if I go and press import, EndNote is going to look at the text file, import each piece of information. It looks like it just finished. I had 50 references there. And we can see automatically that the Find Full Text Search is updating. And now that the import is completed, EndNote is going about searching for these references to see if a full text PDF can be downloaded automatically. So this might take a little bit of time to finish here, but it's going to be able to sort of work behind the scenes. But we just see, as it's chugging along, we see that the searching count is shrinking, which means that the search is progressing. Once the search is finished, the searching heading will disappear, and all of the various outcomes, found PDF, found URL, or not found, would be updated accordingly, depending on whether or not items are located through that Find Full Text search. So again, that's an optional setting for Find Full Text. This is not everyone is importing from text files, but the fact that you can not only capture the references through the import action, but also configure that optional preference to initiate a Find Full Text search automatically upon import, that can be a great time saver, as we see. Instead of me having to perform two separate workflows, it's taking care of this for me all in one action here. So this can be really handy. Now, I might need to close this library and reopen it to allow me to proceed here. I don't think we want to sit for another minute or two till I'll let these 37 references complete. So I think I'm actually going to go ahead and just exit the EndNote application just for a moment to cancel this this Find Full Text search. So I'm just going to go ahead and exit the application and just take a moment to save my changes here. changes are saved on the fly as you're developing your library. You don't have to click the save command like a Word document. EndNote's saving those on the fly. Okay, I'm back in the EndNote application, and I'm just going to go ahead and open that library that I had just been working with here. And I just need to navigate to my examples folder, and that's under my, here on Windows, under the EndNote 20 program folder, shortcut called examples. Perfect. We're back in, perfect. We're back into the sample library here. So that, again, that was a quick overview of the Find Full Text tab on the EndNote Preferences window. Now that I'm back on Preferences, we're just chugging along here. If I move to the next tab down, we have Folder Locations. These are the locations of the various types of content files that you can work with in the EndNote application. We've talked a little bit about output styles. When I formatted my example Word document, I had mentioned we were formatting with the MLA style. That really dictates how my citations will look and how the bibliography will be formatted. Import filters, we just looked at one in action. We had selected the PubMed filter for a text file import. So filters are basically used when you're trying to bring references in from a text file, let's say. The import filter has all of the definitions for the various tags that should be expected in front of each piece of information. And we didn't perform an online search just yet. We actually are going to look at a search in action in just a moment. But there's a type of content file in EndNote called connection files. And those connection files contain definitions for various remote databases and instruct EndNote how EndNote can establish a connection with that remote database, and then how to query the remote database in terms of the syntax and the data layout, things like that. These are all optional content files that you can work within the EndNote application. Now, before we take a look at this custom path that's defined here on Preferences, I just wanted to quickly show you back here in the EndNote program folder. Again, I'm on Microsoft Windows today. If anyone is a Mac OS user, it's a similar structure, similar location. It's just you would go using Finder, you would go to your applications folder. That's where you would find your EndNote 20 application folder, a little bit of a different path here on Microsoft Windows. But once you're in your EndNote program folder, we see that there is a folder called Connections. These are all of the default connection files that are installed with EndNote, a little bit more than 400 by default. We see a folder called Filters as well. These are all of the import filters that are installed with EndNote by default, 367 we see installed with EndNote 20 by default. And same goes for styles. These are all of the output styles that are installed by default with EndNote. By default, we've got just over 500 styles available in the default installation. Now, we've got many more content files available to download from our website, and other users can share content files with you. Let's say a publisher, they might make a custom style for their journal. They might share it with us, but they might host the style on their website, make it available for download. And you can download these content files and incorporate them in your EndNote application. But you wouldn't want to place them in these default content file folders. So if you download a new connection file, you wouldn't want to put it in this connections folder. Same goes for filters or styles. There's a different location, a user-specific location that you could apply to all of these custom content files that you download, and gives you some flexibility with regard to what EndNote is including in your EndNote installation. And if you're using EndNote on a shared workstation, the ability to have separate custom content file locations for all the different user accounts on that machine gives you flexibility with regard to which items you're loading when you're working with the EndNote application. So I'm going to leave this file Explorer window open, but I'm going to return to the EndNote application where we're already on the Folder Locations tab here. And I did want to just point out, we see the default paths for each one of these particular items or locations in the EndNote application. So for any custom style that you download and save in your EndNote application, we see that under, in this particular case, my user folder, which is my employee ID. Within my documents folder, there would be an EndNote subfolder, and then finally a styles folder. Same structure for filters, except that under documents within the EndNote folder, there would be a filter subfolder. Same idea for connection files. If I download a new connection file, it's going to be saved by default under Documents within the EndNote folder inside of the connection subfolder. Now, if I wanted to, I could select a different location. I'd say the bulk of our users don't change this, but you might be in a, I mean, anyone is, free to change it if you'd like, but a scenario where you might find yourself changing something like this would be, let's say you're maybe using EndNote in a, like a network setting, and at your organization you've got multiple EndNote users, and you want to make sure that everyone's drawing from the same set of custom content files. Instead of pointing EndNote to your local documents folder, this might be an instance where maybe your IT department makes an EndNote folder on a server, and inside of that EndNote folder they've got a styles folder, a filters folder, and a connections folder, and they might want to ask all of their EndNote users to point their preferences to these folders on the network drive. So there would just be one location that you would have to administer, and then if every EndNote user points their preferences to this folder on the network drive, again, it would be a lot easier to maintain or curate your list of custom content files. So this is something I'm not going to change today. It's very simple to do so. You would just press select folder next to the particular type of content file it is, and you would just navigate to whatever alternate location it is that you would want to set. I will show in action this folder get created. I'm going to leave all of my default paths designated. Again, the default location is under your documents folder instead of an EndNote subfolder. Now, if I click OK here, just to close preferences temporarily, I've got, I believe, let's see here, if I open up another File Explorer window, if I navigate to Documents, we can see that there is no EndNote folder in here. That only gets created when you save your first custom content file. So I did want to point that out just to recap. This is like a fresh EndNote installation. I've got my default preferences configured where it would be saving to documents, but until I save a custom content file, that path does not yet exist. I'm going to walk you through downloading a custom content file because this might be helpful. Even, aside from this particular aspect of preferences, like I mentioned, you might come across a custom style that you want to include in your EndNote installation, and again, these steps would be really beneficial. I'm going to go to Mozilla Firefox, where I've already navigated to the downloads page at endnote.com. You can get here, like I mentioned, if you visit endnote.com, there's a tab you can click on called Downloads. Alternately, you can visit endnote.com/downloads. That'll take you right to this page. We've got various resources here. If you want to download an EndNote update, download a new installer for one of your EndNote installations, a fresh installer, you can do that here. But this is also where you're going to find those content files, like I mentioned. So we see that we've got our output styles repository linked here, our filters repository, and our connection files repository. Thousands of resources for each type of content file. Like I mentioned, even though there are only several hundred for each type that's installed by default, you can always come here and augment your list of custom content files from this these tables of resources. I'm going to go ahead and just download a new style as an example. I'm going to go ahead and click Add Output Styles. Again, we've just surpassed as you see here, the 7,000 style threshold. And so if I scroll down a little bit, we see that overall in our repository, we have 7,253 styles. If I wanted to, I can use this table to search for a particular style if I wanted to by keyword. I could resort by any one of these pieces of information if I'd like. By default, the table is sorted chronologically. Our most recently published styles are listed first. So again, that's the default listing of these resources. As an example here, let's go ahead and let's download, we'll just choose this first item on the list, European Journal of Pediatric Surgery Reports. If I want to incorporate this in my EndNote installation, I would just press download. And it wouldn't matter where it downloads initially. Your browser may prompt you to open or save it. I would go ahead and say save it to start with. Again, doesn't matter where it downloads initially. Your browser, depending on what you're using, let's say maybe Google Chrome, might just save it automatically, not even give you the option to open it right away. Once the file gets downloaded, that's when you can open that file. So right here in Mozilla Firefox, if I just look at my downloads list, I could open it from here. Alternately, I could go to my downloads folder where the file's been downloaded. unformatted. I can double-click on it from here either way. We see that double-clicking on the style would open it for editing in the EndNote installation here. And if I want to include this in my EndNote program, this new style, I would be able to go to the File menu. Now that I've got the style for open for editing, I can choose Save As. And all I need to do is define a name for the style. I don't need to choose a location based on the preferences that we had looked at on the folder locations tab. EndNote knows where this needs to be saved. I just need to give the style a name. We can see that EndNote's appended the word copy at the end of the name. That's probably extraneous here. I'm just going to go ahead and take that off. And whenever I'm ready, I just go ahead and make sure I've got the appropriate name set. I would press the Save button here. Now, before we go look for it in the EndNote application, I just want to go back to my Documents folder once more using File Explorer. Okay, there we go, because we see now I have an EndNote folder. EndNote created this for me automatically. In this new installation, I've only interacted with custom styles. That's why we've only got the style subfolder. If I do the same action with a filter, I would end up with the filter subfolder, and if I perform the same save as action in EndNote for a connection file, I would end up with that connection subfolder. So again, these are items you can create by hand if you want to, but EndNote will do this for you automatically as you interact with these custom content files. If I open my styles folder here, I see I've got my custom style that I just saved in my EndNote application. And I did want to point out, now that I've got this path created, instead of me, downloading a style, opening it for editing in EndNote, and then performing that save as command, if I wanted to, I could, let's do the drug research style here. I could download this to my drive, save this instead. And again, I could go to my downloads folder. I could double click on the drug research style. I can go, perform that save as action. But because that path, that folder structure has already been created for me in Documents now, I could simply copy or cut this particular downloaded file. And if I want to, I can just navigate to this, like I mentioned, in Documents. I've now got an EndNote folder. I've already saved a custom style, so I've already got the style subfolder. I could just do a paste if I wanted to. I could just paste that downloaded style file, and instead of performing that save as command that we did through EndNote itself, and both of these styles would now be available in the EndNote application. If I close my style editor for that first style we downloaded, I can go back to my library window, go to Tools, Output Styles, Open Style Manager, and I just want to confirm, both of these styles that we had just saved to the EndNote application, EuroJ Pediatric Surge Rep. Let's just find that on the list here. Yep, there's the first style that I just downloaded. It's part of my style manager now. I can mark it as a favorite if this is a style that I might use regularly. And if I scroll up, I just want to confirm, perfect, there it is. We've got drug research as well. So just to recap, if I go back to Preferences and return to folder locations, these paths are where the custom content files will reside, whether it be in your Documents folder as part of the default location, or whether you override this and maybe point to a network drive instead. That's your choice. But again, wherever you've designated these custom content files to be saved, that's where EndNote would save them automatically if you open one for editing and you choose that save as command that we had looked at just a moment ago. Once you've done that at least once, so that these folders get created wherever you've designated, if you want to, outside of EndNote, you can manually place your custom content files in those folders without resaving them. A personal preference, which approach you choose. But I did want to give some context in regard to where these files exist on your hard drive behind the scenes. So hope that helps. Okay, just chugging along here. If we go back to Preferences, we'll go to the Formatting tab next. We've got a couple of checkboxes here. The first option is actually another legacy setting. This is something that could go away at some point in the future, but we've retained it just to ensure that we've kept some compatibility between versions of EndNote if you want to export your preferences from one machine to another. The first setting we see here is called Suggest Formatting with EndNote Cite While You Write Add-in if the document type is supported. This relates to a feature called Format Paper. This is sort of the the formatting solution that existed before Cite While You Write, which is our add-in for Microsoft Word. You can use the Format Paper feature to format references in an RTF document, a rich text formatted document, so that you could copy and paste temporary citations like we see here in this example RTF file. These bracketed placeholders, we're going to actually take a look at this format closer in just a bit. But in this example RTF document, I've got a couple of temporary citations added here, and if I wanted to, I can close this document. In EndNote itself, go to the Tools menu, point my mouse over Format Paper. I've got the command here called Format Paper, where I can then select either an RTF document or an open office document as well. I can format either type of document with Format Paper. I've got that example file that we were just looking at in Downloads, so I can select it here, choose Open, and again, we see on Format Paper, EndNote has identified my temporary citations, and if I want to, I can click, let's say I want to format with MLA, just like we did in Word. I can click Format, and what EndNote will do is make a second document based off of the original document itself, so that if we go look at Downloads once more, I've got this new RTF file, and we would see instead of those placeholders, those bracketed placeholders, we've actually got a formatted in-text citations and a bibliography at the end of the document. This is, again, a great solution. It's much more streamlined with Cite While You Write in Microsoft Word. This is a great solution still if you're using a non-Word word processor. Let's say perhaps you prefer Google Docs. You can still save a Google Doc document as an RTF file and run it through the Format Paper command. But older versions of EndNote would allow you to select a Word document through this Format Paper browse interface here. And with this preference that was turned on by default, as we saw here, if you tried to select a doc or a docx file from Microsoft Word for Format Paper, EndNote would tell you, don't use Format Paper, use Cite While You Write instead. With recent versions of EndNote, if I just go back just for a moment, with recent versions of EndNote, if you go to select an item for Format Paper, it won't even show you a Word document. It's only going to show you, as we see on this file types drop-down, RTF files or ODT files related to Open Office. So again, the preference is still present. It may be taken off at some point, but to keep retain sort of some backwards compatibility with the structure of our preferences, we've left it. But just to recap, on Windows and Mac OS, this first checkbox is really just a legacy setting that really doesn't come into play in EndNote 20 any longer. The next preference that we have here is a checkbox called Omit Author and/or Year from Formatted Citation if removed from temporary citation. This is turned on by default. And just to show this in action here, if I press OK and return to my real basic Microsoft Word document, I'm formatting with MLA, which just uses author information as in-text citations. Let's switch to a style that uses both author and year. I'm going to click the style drop-down. I'll choose, let's say, APA 7th, just as an example here. Perfect. So we see that for a traditional APA 7th citation, we've got both the author and year. This is a formatted document. If I wanted to see temporary citations, those placeholders that exist until a citation is formatted, what I can do here is I would want to make sure I have a backup of my document just in case. Since this is a sample document, I'm not going to perform those extra steps. But if this was a real document you were working on, I would perform a regular save to make sure that your primary document's up to date. Then you can perform a save as in Word so that you save a second version just in case. That way you have a backup if something were to go awry. But if I want to look at my temporary citations now, I can click Convert Citations in Bibliography. I've got the option for Convert to Unformatted Citations. That's going to temporarily remove my bibliography and revert all of my formatted in-text citations to what we call temporary citations. These are bracketed placeholders that basically tell EndNote where to format a particular reference in your document. As we see, a fully fleshed out temporary citation typically has the first author's surname, the publication year, and the record number for that particular entry in your library. And with that setting that we had noted, and before we proceed, I just want to bring up the setting text one more time. The second checkbox on the Formatting tab says Omit Author and/or Year from Formatted Citation if removed from temporary citation. With that turned on, as it is by default, if I go to one of my temporary citations, and let's say maybe this first item, if I take the year out of the temporary citation, citation so that it's just the author name and the record number, with that preference enabled, that's a clue to EndNote that I actually want to exclude the author from this particular citation. So now that I've customized this temporary citation, and to take the year out, if I press Update Citations in Bibliography, everything reformats, but we see for this particular entry, EndNote has left out the year because it was not part of the temporary citation, and with that particular preference enabled, that tells EndNote that I want to exclude that particular bit of information from the formatted citation. If I don't want that to occur, if I want to ensure that all of the authors and years appear for all of my formatted citations, regardless of whether or not they're part of the temporary citation, I could turn this off just by unchecking this box. I would press OK here, or save if you're on Mac OS. And if I return to my Microsoft Word document, again, the year is still missing from this citation, this temporary citation, but because I've toggled that setting to tell EndNote, don't care about that. You know, it doesn't matter if the year's missing. If my style is set to output a year, include the year. And again, because I've toggled that setting, if I reformat with APA 7th, let me unformat and reformat. There we go. We see I did have to unformat and reformat to get it to consider the year again. But we see that because I unformatted and reformatted with this setting turned off, we see that even though that wasn't part of the temporary citation, the 1997 year, EndNote still put it in the formatted reference. So this is a great way. Again, not many people will find themselves reconfiguring this setting in preferences on the EndNote preferences window, but this might be something if maybe you had, as you were adding references to your document, if maybe you had inconsistent data, or you know, just for whatever reason, maybe you were manually typing in your temporary citations to add them to your body of text, and you had omitted one of those 2 bits of information, author a year. You can come here and uncheck this option, and if, like I said, even if that information was missing, EndNote would sort of override that and still include that information, as long as your style was set to show author and year, and both of those bits of information were populated within your EndNote library references. I'm going to turn this back on here. This is usually on by default, like I mentioned. Now, the last setting on formatting, on the formatting tab, is the merging of duplicates in your bibliography. Like I mentioned, EndNote has a feature called Find Duplicates that you can scan your library and remove extraneous duplicate entries for your EndNote library references, but sometimes duplicates can you know, slip through the cracks. This is turned on by default. If EndNote does spot a duplicate in your document, EndNote will merge those items so that there's just a single entry in the bibliography. If I click OK here again and go back to my Word document, both of these, I'm actually going to unformat one more time. If I go back to Convert Citations in Bibliography, Convert to Unformatted Citations, I just wanted to point out these 2 Pepperberg citations are actually for the same article, the same published article, but we see that there are 2 different record numbers signifying these are actually, you know, duplicate entries. Both of these citations are not pointing to the same entry in my library. Even though they're duplicates, with that setting turned on to, again, in your, on the formatting tab, if you've got that checkbox to merge duplicates in the bibliography, with that turned on, even though you've got duplicates in your text, EndNote will suppress those duplicates and make sure that there's only one formatted reference for that particular entry in your text. Now, just to show this in action, if I go back to my EndNote Preferences window once more, Edit, Preferences, on the Formatting tab, if I actually turn this off by unchecking the box and I press OK, if I return to my Word document once more and just update my citations in bibliography, all right, we see that EndNote is no longer, merging duplicates. EndNote is, for this particular style, appending an A and a B because they're sort of ambiguous and wanting to let the reader know that these 2 citations point to 2 different entries in my bibliography. But we can see that this is, erroneous. Both of these entries are for the same reference. Again, this is something you would typically not want to have occur. So if there's, this is turned on by default, but if there's any chance that you've got duplicate references cited in your document, you would want to make sure that you leave this option, Merge Duplicates in Bibliography, enabled, so that if there were duplicates, if I turn this back on and return to Word, just to confirm, if I run Update Citations in Bibliography, we see that EndNote, once again, suppresses the duplicate. We've just got the one entry in the text for that, in the bibliography for that particular citation in the text. So I wanted to point that out. Okay, just chugging along here. If we go back to preferences, we're now on the libraries tab. This tab is pretty straightforward. We might not be looking at each one of these options in action, but these settings are related to how you want EndNote to start. When EndNote launches, the default setting is to just automatically open the most recently used library, you know, a great default setting, but you might want to override that with some other functionality. We see on this drop down here, I could choose open the specified libraries instead. And for me to configure this, I would need to have whatever libraries it is open that I want EndNote to launch with automatically. Right now, I've just got the sample library open. This is fine for our test. But with this library open, I can click Add Open Libraries. Whichever libraries are open at the time of pressing Add Open Libraries, they'll all be listed here. You could have 5 libraries that you're working with, and if you want them all to open with EndNote, you could, you know, if you launch them all at once, come to the Libraries tab and press Add Open Libraries. You would have the, you know, the file path to each one of those entries on your library. And again, when you relaunch the application going forward, all of those libraries would open with the start of EndNote. I did want to mention, if you have a shared library, if you're part of a library sharing team and you want that library to open automatically, you can do so. You would just to confirm, you would go to, you know, File, Open Shared Library. Oh, that's something I'll have to configure in just a moment. But once you've opened your shared library, if you return to Preferences, just like we had noted here, you would just click Add Open Libraries. That shared library would be part of this list. Any item that you wanted to remove, as the button sort of implies, you would just click on a particular entry here, press Remove Library. So maybe if you did have 5 libraries open at the time of pressing Add Open Libraries, but you just want 3 to open automatically, you can, on the list of items, you can select the items that you don't want to open and say Remove Library. Your choice, you have full control over that. And then the last 2 options you've got is that you might not want EndNote to open any library automatically, but you might want EndNote to show you the Select a Reference Library prompt each time EndNote launches, so that you can quickly select whatever library it is that you want to work with. If you choose Prompt to select a library, that's what would happen. And if you just want EndNote to open on the transitional background window, not launching with any library, not giving you a prompt to open a library automatically, you can just you can choose Do Nothing. And again, EndNote will launch with the transitional background window, and from there you would have control over whether you're opening a library that already exists, or a library that someone shared with you, or opening, rather creating a new library if perhaps you're getting started from scratch. I'm going to go ahead and just leave mine set to open the most recently used library, and go ahead and just press Apply to make sure that that change is registered here. Now, onto the PDF Handling tab. I think I was mentioning while we were covering the agenda items that when you attach a PDF, or really any file linked to an EndNote library record, EndNote attaches the file with the existing name and links that, associates that reference, that file with whatever reference it is in your library. Now, for PDF attachments, if you'd like to increase the consistency with the naming convention of your PDFs, you can override that default name and ask EndNote to look at up to 3 fields in your EndNote library to, again, sort of unify or uniformly name your PDF articles. So just as an example here, let's go ahead and I'm going to go ahead and press cancel in this window. I've got a PDF in my downloads folder here. It's an example article, and we can see I've got it selected right now. It's really just the DOI number for that published article as the name of the PDF. And if I want to link this to an EndNote library record, I would just go back to my library. A couple of ways you can do this, but the most straightforward method to add an attachment would be to select whatever entry it is in the library you want to link that file to. You can now press Attach File in the Summary tab. Like I mentioned, it doesn't have to be a PDF. It could be a Word document. It could be an Excel spreadsheet, things like that. But if I navigate to my Downloads folder, it's the PDF that I want to select just for this example here. So if I scroll down a bit, perfect. I could double-click on the entry to attach the file, or I can single-click as I've done here, and I can press Open either way. Perfect. So we see that the file that I've pointed to in my Downloads folder is now linked to this particular entry in my EndNote library with the default name. And again, the original name was just the DOI number for that particular article. That's perfectly fine, but if I wanted to, again, increase the consistency for my PDF naming convention in my library, I could go and set EndNote's preferences to automatically rename new attachments so that they utilize metadata from my EndNote library record to uniformly name these files linked to my library records. I'm going to go and delete this attachment here because this preference is for new attachments. I will point out there's a similar command for renaming existing attachments, but I want to show this sort of the second part of this piece of the lesson plan here. So I'm just going to, like I mentioned, temporarily remove that attachment that we just linked, which I've just done here. And if I go ahead and go back to my edit dropdown to select preferences, before relinking the file, if I wanted EndNote to automatically rename it for me, I would want to change the radio button that's selected here. Like I mentioned, by default, EndNote does not rename PDF attachments. But if I wanted to have EndNote, again, uniformly name these items linked to my library records, I could use one of these hard-coded, predefined options. I could have EndNote look at the author field, year field, title field, author and title, author or year, just the title, or I could use custom, and I can, like I mentioned, define up to 3 fields that I would want EndNote to draw from when renaming my PDF attachments. Now, I did want to point out, this is mentioned on the preferences window, but your custom names, your custom file names can be up to 50 characters long. And for each one of the fields that you select, EndNote is going to use 15 characters from those fields. So these 50 characters also includes the file extension, like .pdf. I did want to point that out. So if you use author plus year plus title, let's say, as your renaming convention, up to 15 characters from author would be included, 15 characters from year, and 15 characters from title would be included to spell out this custom file name. So I did want to point that out. So there's a chance, you might have a very long list of authors, or you might have a very long title where the entire field data does not become part of the custom name. It will just be the basis, at least the start of that part of the naming convention. So let's go and, I'm going to go and just choose one of these hard-coded options here. Let's go ahead and leave author plus year plus title selected. I think that's perfectly fine. If I press OK, now that I've reconfigured the setting, and I go to link my file again, I've got that same example reference highlighted. I'll press attach file once more. I'm going to go use this browse window to select my PDF attachment. Again, we see that the original file has the name of, has rather the DOI as its file name. Now that it's selected, if I press open, perfect. So we see, it's a little bit truncated here, but we see what EndNote has done is it's taken the metadata associated with this particular reference. So in this instance, if I go to the Edit tab, in my renaming convention, it's looking at author, it's looking at year and title, and it's applied that metadata to the naming convention of my attachment. So it really doesn't have any impact on my EndNote usage otherwise, the name of my attachments. But if I wanted consistency in my PDF naming convention, this option to automatically rename PDFs is really handy. Now, like I was describing, this preference that we just reconfigured is for new PDF attachments going forward. If you've got existing attachments that you want to rename, you would want to select your references in your EndNote library. So I've just, under all references, I've just pressed Control-A to highlight all of the entries in my library here. Once I've got those references selected, if I want to rename existing PDFs, I can go to the References drop-down. I've got the menu item here for File Attachments. And if I then point my mouse over that, I've got the option to rename PDFs. If I click here, I get a confirmation window, that says out of these so many references, are you sure you want to rename all of these PDF attachments? This can't be undone, so it is a good idea to make sure you back up your library before performing a global edit like this, just in case. This is a sample library. I don't need to make a backup. But if I press OK, I'll get a configuration window similar to that custom configuration window that we saw on the preferences screen, where I can choose up to 3 fields that I would want EndNote to use for the PDF renaming convention. Let's stick with that same structure that we had selected from preferences. So I'll ask EndNote first, look at my author field. choose 15 characters from there. Look at my year field, choose up to 15 characters for there. Usually you're going to just have 4 characters, 4-digit years from the year field. And then for the third bit of information, we will have title as the third criteria. If I press OK now, since this is configured, I get another confirmation window that says how many items were renamed. If I click OK, it looks like I have 22 PDFs in this library. And now I can start clicking around here because, again, if we look at the tab within the summary area on the tabs panel, we see that I've got a similar naming convention for all of my PDFs. We see that it draws from the author field first, the year next, and the title information after that. So again, the name of my attachment really doesn't have any bearing on my other EndNote usage. But if you like to have consistency, you know, an organized library, organized materials, it is nice to know that you've got the flexibility to, you know, uniformly rename your PDF attachments if desired. And the last element that I wanted to touch on here on the PDF handling tab is the ability to define a PDF auto import folder. If you are coming across PDFs in your discovery phase and you want to import those into your EndNote library, you can always do that manually. If you go to the File menu, point your mouse over Import here on Windows. If you're importing a single PDF, you can choose File. If you've got a folder of PDFs, you can initiate that action by selecting Folder. So this is something you can always invoke manually. But if you want EndNote to automatically import your PDFs to save a little bit of time, from the Preferences window here, you can check the box under PDF Handling to enable automatic importing. And we see that I just need to define what folder it is that I want EndNote to look at. So in my Downloads folder, I've already created a subfolder for this purpose. I've created a folder called PDF Auto Import. When you do this, your folder name doesn't have to be as precise or you know, exact. It could have any name you'd like, but something related to its purpose usually makes the most sense, I would say. But if I go ahead and click OK here, I've got that path defined. And now when I launch the application, each time I launch EndNote will check this folder for PDFs to import and save me some time. So just to show that in action, if I press OK, if I now go to the File menu and just exit the application, it'll just take a moment to, you know, sort of process my changes, save my changes. Now that EndNote's closed and I relaunch it here, I can go ahead and go back to my sample library and just navigating to my examples folder where this particular library resides. Perfect. All right, so I'm back in my EndNote library, and because my PDF auto import folder already had some PDFs in it, we see that the import action has been invoked automatically. And EndNote is looking at each one of my PDFs to try to find the DOI number of the article somewhere in the first 2 pages of text or the metadata. And if that DOI is found, EndNote will query a partner database called Crossref, which is sort of a metadata search engine to try to populate references in my library, and will attach the PDF at the same time. So it looks like I had 12 PDFs in this PDF auto import folder, and for a handful of them, you know, for 4 of these here, I was able to find, or EndNote rather, was able to find the DOI number for these particular articles. And for these entries here, EndNote was able to find the DOI, queried the Crossref database, attached the PDF at the same time, and, you know, populated the reference in my EndNote library. So all of those actions sort of take place at the same time. Now, for a handful of these here, we do see that it's sort of a bare bones entry in the library. It's just, we see an entry that has a little paperclip signifying the file attachment, but we see that all we've got in terms of record data is the title of the PDF in the title field surrounded by brackets. Now, this is an indicator that EndNote was not able to find a DOI number for these particular items here. And in that scenario, EndNote still makes a record and attaches the PDF. But if EndNote can't query on a DOI number, it's not going to be able to populate any information in those references in your EndNote library. And you can go in if you want to populate the missing information, or you can trash those references and recreate them some other way. But I did just want to quickly show you here, back in my Downloads folder, if I now navigate into my PDF Auto Import folder, we see that I now have an imported subfolder. Initially, that doesn't exist. All of your PDFs would be on the primary level. But once EndNote imports a PDF, that item gets moved to this imported subfolder so that EndNote doesn't try to import it again. And all of these imported items, they're now linked to my library through another file. If I wanted to keep these for backup purposes, I would be able to do so. If I wanted to clean up my drive and take these out, I would be safe knowing that these aren't the versions that EndNote is accessing. And if I wanted to trash all of these imported items, I would be able to do so if I'd like. So I did want to mention that. Okay, just chugging along here. I do see we're going to run a little bit over the allotted time, so if anyone does need to drop off the call, again, this session is being recorded. Feel free to review the rest of the class at your convenience with a recording link if necessary, but if you've got another 15 minutes or so that you can stick around with me, I think we'll be able to finish this lesson and make sure we cover all aspects of the preferences interface. Okay, so I'm back here. My EndNote is just locked up for a moment, and I'm just checking to see why that might be. Let's see. Okay, there we go. Not sure what was holding it up, but I'm just going to launch EndNote once more. All right, perfect. I'm back in the application. We're just chugging along here. I'm going to open up my sample library one more time. All right. And now if we go back to preferences, we've just finished discussing PDF handling. Quickly, we're going to look at the read or unread status, like I was mentioning. This is sort of this has been part of the EndNote desktop application for a number of years now. It really isn't going. It's not frequently used by a lot of users, and in EndNote 20, it's sort of taken a back burner. It's still completely configurable. It's just not configured by default. So you might have remembered that part of the read or unread status is displaying its state or its status as a display column here. So if this is something, if you want to be able to tell whether or not you've interacted with a particular reference, you would want to make sure that you add this as a display column. Just to confirm, if you go back to preferences under display fields to do so, you're just making sure that one of your columns is set to read/unread status. Now, in addition to that, on the read/unread tab, what I would do is I would check actually all of these. It's your choice how you configure this, but I would at least check the option to mark unread references as unread. If I just start with by selecting this option here, we see that items that have been that are unread are bolded, and if if I click in its little box, or excuse me, in its little bubble here on the left, that can toggle its read or unread status. I can also, for any item, I can select it by single left clicking on it, and then I can right click on that item, and you see I've got the option to toggle its read or unread status here as well. I can mark this item as read. If I want to make it a little bit easier to toggle its read or unread status, back on preferences, I could, like I mentioned, check these options here. I can mark it to change reference, mark it as read once I'm viewing it as the reference itself, the PDF, or the preview within the library window, or when I'm changing its rating. Rating is something I don't believe we looked at when we talked about display fields, so we'll circle back around in just a moment for that. But with all of these items marked, if I click OK, now instead of just, excuse me, instead of just clicking on its read or unread bubble, I could click on the reference itself. I could just click right here over the title. I can, click, really any one of the display fields. I can click on it and just selecting the item, and versus marking its box, I can now just click on an item. Doing so marks it as read, because the idea is, I've taken a look at the underlying metadata on the summary tab, or perhaps I've gone to the edit tab here to look at all of the underlying information for a particular reference. The rating information, again, is something that not every user is taking advantage of. It's taking a little bit of a back seat in EndNote 20. Still available if you want to go to preferences again, go to the display fields tab. This is one of the pieces of, it's not reference data, I would say, but it's a identifier related to each one of your references. Let's temporarily change, let's go ahead and set custom column 10 to be the rating information, which we find somewhat toward the top of the list here. If I've got that selected and I click OK, perfect. We can see that each one of my entries in my library, I have the ability to apply a rating system to, a 5-star rating system. Now, not everyone, like I was mentioning, is looking to do this. Your rating system really is personal preference. I would say in terms of real-world rating systems that I've seen when speaking to EndNote users, the rating that they might apply is the likelihood of including that particular item in a research project that they might be developing in Microsoft Word. So really, it's personal preference as to what their rating signifies. But if you, like I was showing you here, if I go back to preferences, back to the read or unread status tab, I could, if I check this box, I could mark a reference as read upon changing its rating. Just to show you here, I can, if I click just on any one of these stars for any one of these unread references, we see that it becomes read automatically. So this is really handy. Again, not everyone's looking to do this. It's the read or unread state or status is sort of taking a back seat in EndNote 20, but it is fully reconfigurable if you want to turn this back on. We just simplified it a little bit, the interface here in EndNote 20 to streamline the overall interface and modernize the look and feel of the library window. Just chugging along here, if we go to the Reference Types tab, like I was mentioning, when you're manually adding a reference to your EndNote library, which I'll go ahead and do that just here quickly. If I go to the References menu and I select New Reference, this is something you can do on Mac OS or Windows. We see that the Reference Type dropdown by default is set to be a journal article. I'd probably say this is probably the most common type of research material, but we've got dozens of reference types. There are quite a few types of research materials that you might be tracking with EndNote. So if you work with book references more often, you might want to go, if I close this new reference here, you might want to change on the Reference Types tab, you might want to change your default reference type to book to save you a click each time you're manually adding a reference. Now this, like I was describing when we were covering the agenda items, if you click Modify Reference Types, this is where you can define your various reference types. You see that each reference type is linked to the generic reference type and the generic fields that exist in EndNote itself. But if let's change from book back to journal article, let's say, depending on the reference type that you select, some of these field labels may be a little bit different than other reference types. So we see that, for journal article, we see that secondary title is actually labeled as the journal field. If I change to, let's say, newspaper article instead, we see that the author field is actually called reporter, because that's a little bit more appropriate for this type of reference that I might be adding to my library. I can, if there are particular fields I don't want to be part of my library record, I can delete the field and delete that label. That field will no longer be an entry for that particular type of reference. If I want to add a field, like I was mentioning, maybe I've got a I want to, let's say, track reprint status, or I see we've actually got a field for that. But if I have, any sort of a custom keyword or something like that that I want to apply for newspaper articles, let's say, I can define, in this case, custom 3 to be called custom keyword, so that if I go back to my EndNote library and I go to create a new reference, let's say, and I set my reference type to be newspaper article, just to show you here, I've got a field that's here it is, called custom keyword. So I've modified this reference type to change a particular field, change the label of a particular field in my EndNote library. So this is, like I said, there's a lot of power to the reference types, worthy of a lesson plan of its own. But if you want to change your reference types at all, this is where you would do so. Now, once you've customized your reference types, if you want to import those into another computer where you're working with EndNote, or if you want to share them with a colleague or a co-author, you could export your customized reference types to an XML file. You can save this anywhere. I might suggest right on your desktop for ease of access. You can call it anything you'd like, but something related to the type of file. ENREF types might make sense. Once that's saved, like I mentioned, you can take this to another EndNote installation. You can give it to a colleague, and that person can download the file, come into their copy of EndNote. They can import that custom XML file that you shared, so that EndNote, their copy of EndNote would incorporate all of your customizations. Now, I did want to mention, like this note indicates here, that importing a new ref type XML file will overwrite your current reference types. So let's say you and a co-author are collaborating on a project, and you've customized some reference types and you've shared those with your colleague in an XML file. If your colleague has any existing customized reference types, that person might want to export those existing customizations first, so that once they've backed up their existing reference types, they could import your custom reference types for whatever project you're working on. And then once you're done, or once that person's done, they can go and import their original reference types again. Because just to recap, incorporating someone else's customized reference types won't add them to your customizations all of your existing reference types would be overwritten with the reference types that exist in that XML file. So I did want to point that out. It is really important to, if you've got customized reference types and you want to, share with a colleague or incorporate a colleague's changes, back up your existing customizations first using export. That way you can always recreate those changes automatically without doing that from scratch each and every time. So I did want to point that out. Okay, moving on to the sorting tab, we see this is a pretty straightforward. I don't think we need to see this in action, but I did want to give some context to these settings here. When you're sorting, whether it be on your library window or in a bibliography, let's say, EndNote can customize the sort of, if you're sorting by an author column, an author field, there might be, compound let's say names, prepositions in names such as von or van or de that you would not want to have EndNote sort that particular entry by. So just as an example here, I know that in my library I've got a reference from an author whose surname is von Baern, and I've just scrolled down to it here just to highlight it. And I might there might be certain sort orders, bibliographic sort orders for my formatted reference list, or just myself in my EndNote library, where I might not want this to show up under V for Von. I might actually want it to show under B for Baern. So if I want that to take place, I would go back to Edit. I would select Preferences here. And then under the author fields, I would go ahead and type in the preposition at the start of that surname. And I did want to mention for the author entries that you add, they are case sensitive. So if I typed in capital V, lowercase o-n, it would not find my existing entry here because it's all lowercase. So I want to make sure that it matches what I'm using in my library. I'll go ahead and add that. Before we move on, I did want to mention that the same doesn't apply for titles. For titles, it's not case sensitive. So if this existing entry for the, it would include lowercase the, or a version of the where T is capitalized. So again, case sensitivity doesn't apply for title entries, but it does for author field entries. Now that I've got my Von added here, I can go and press OK to save that change. And you will only see it take effect when I resort my library. So I've just returned to my library window. Von Baern is still under V for Von due to the previous sort criteria. But if I just click this column label for author, and it will resort my entries. Let me do that one more time, by author. Perfect. There we go. We're A to Z sort in my no, I'm actually Z to A. There we go. We're A to Z sort in my library, and where Von Baern had been showing up under the V's for the author field information, we now see that it's listed under the B as in boy or Baern for the author's sort of primary surname, not the preposition. So I did want to point that out. This is a great solution if you want to sort of have control over some of these elements, whether it be author names or how particular titles began. You have some control over how EndNote is storing these elements in your EndNote library. Now, the next tab, spell check, like I was mentioning, is not something you'll find under EndNote Desktop for Mac OS. It doesn't mean that EndNote Desktop for Mac OS does not have spell check. It's just on the Mac OS side using the built-in spell checker that's part of the operating system. On Microsoft Windows, we are still utilizing, again, I was mentioning technology from a company called Wintertree for the spell check functionality in EndNote 20. So from the spell check tab here on EndNote 20 for Windows, I could click options. All of these options are pretty straightforward, just based on how they're defined. So I'm not going to go through these list of checkboxes, but you can see things. You can ignore capitalized words, all caps words. You can ignore domain names, things like that. This is where you would also define your primary or your main dictionary language. You can see we've got, an American English, I believe is the default. We've got an American English medical dictionary, a couple of Brazilian dictionaries, British English, Finnish, French, a lot of options here. So I did want to point that out. And you do have some control over how EndNote is serving up your suggestions. The default is the suggestions will appear moderately fast and accurate. But if you want it to be quicker, you can say you want them to come up quickly, fast, but less accurate. Or if you want to increase the accuracy, you can say slow but accurate. I'm going to leave my moderately fast and accurate option selected here. Click OK. The other aspect of this tab is dictionaries. If I click there, this is where you would find whatever dictionary you've got designated as your default spell check dictionary. We can see that the SSCEAM.TLX dictionary is the American English dictionary. If you wanted to change that, you could do so here by pressing Add File. This is going to show you all of the dictionaries available in EndNote Desktop. And you would be able to see the terms that are part of this dictionary. So these are all of the default terms that are part of this American English dictionary here. As you're spell checking references, you can modify the entries. If you wanted to upfront modify terms, if you know there are words that you're going to be using in your references quite often, you want to make sure that EndNote is not stopping on those, you can add those up front if you'd like. But again, that's something you can also do as you're working through spell check in your EndNote library. If you've got a list of terms that you've customized, excuse me, you could import those into your dictionary en masse just with one action. And if you've gone through and done the legwork to customize a dictionary and you want to share it with a team member or a colleague, you can export that to a text file and share that with others as well. So I'm not going to really excuse me, change anything here, but I did just want to quickly show you. If I close this window, press OK here, if I double click on one of my references so that I'm looking at my tabs panel and I'm on what we call the edit tab, which is all of the underlying excuse me, metadata for this particular entry that's selected in my reference list panel, I can go to the library menu. I can point my mouse over, excuse me, I can click on spell check. This will have EndNote, scan through the edit tab here. Let me actually show that one more time. That seemed to go very quickly. There we go. Okay, so it's actually spell checking now, and we see that it's come across an abbreviation for December. It's got a suggestion for me if that's something that I might want to, or I might be using in another reference. I can add that if I want, so that it doesn't stop. Oh, getting an error here. I think I need to change my user dictionary. That's the trouble. But just sort of giving you an idea of what this looks like, basically. Pretty common functionality, not unique to EndNote spell checker. But just to recap, in EndNote Desktop for Windows, you've got a tab called spell checker where you can configure these settings. If you're using EndNote 20 on Mac OS, excuse me, EndNote is relying on the spell checker built into Mac OS. So hope that helps. Chugging right along here, just a couple more tabs. The sync tab, this is the functionality like I mentioned. If you want to coordinate the contents of a particular EndNote library with EndNote Online so that you can transfer the contents of a library from one computer to another automatically without you having to move that library back and forth, that's what the sync tab can achieve for you. There are a couple of methods to configure the sync functionality, but while we're here, I can go and just press Enable Sync. Excuse me. If I did not yet have an EndNote Online account, I can make one for free right now by clicking Sign Up. And when you have access to EndNote Desktop and you link your desktop license to EndNote Online, you get an enhanced EndNote Online account for 2 years where you have no limit in terms of how many references and file attachments that you can store in the cloud for that 2-year period. You also have additional content files that you can use in EndNote Online by linking your EndNote Online account to your desktop license. Now, I already got an EndNote Online account, so instead of creating one from scratch, I'm just going to log into it here quickly. If I use the correct credentials, perfect. Now, if I press OK, all right, so we see my credentials are stored here on the same tab. If I might have typed my password in incorrectly anywhere where I'm prompted for my EndNote Online credentials, I can always come to the Sync tab and correct that here if I need to. But now that I've enabled Sync and I've got my credentials defined, if I press OK, I have to pick a particular library that I'm syncing with EndNote Online. You can create various desktop libraries, but you do have to pick one primary library that you're using for EndNote sync and library sharing if you choose to configure that. So just as an example today, I'm going to use this sample library that I have open. I can now go to the library dropdown. I can click on Sync. And I am syncing a library different than the last, which is fine. You might not see this warning, but I'm going to go and say yes. Yeah, perfect. And so the first time you sync, you'll get a prompt to make a backup just in case. Again, because this is a sample library, I don't need to do that. But if I had not had a backup for an actual project library that I'm developing, I would want to say yes and save that to my drive. Due to time constraints, I'm going to go and say no. And EndNote is just going to coordinate the contents of this desktop library with my EndNote Online account. If it's a two-way street, so if you're using an existing EndNote Online account for your syncing action, and there were any groups or references in that online account, those would be brought down, as well as anything unique in the desktop library being sent up to EndNote Online. So you might not have noticed, but I actually had a group that existed in EndNote Online called Online References. That group got brought down to my desktop library, and those 10 references were incorporated as well. Those were all pulled down from my EndNote Online account, and we can check sync status, and we see that this screen is letting me know that sync is still taking place behind the scenes here. EndNote is also sending all of my library information up to EndNote Online. And once this is finished, I'll have some details, some statistics related to how many groups, references, and file attachments that have been sent from EndNote Online to EndNote Desktop and vice versa. So this is just wrapping up right now, and I just want to show it before we move on. So this is just performing its final action before it finishes here. And of course, it's taking longer because we're sitting here watching it. So give me just a moment. I just want to show you the sync status details before we go back to preferences. Let me go ahead, and my EndNote went to a busy state here just for a moment. And again, this information, the sync status details are really, I mean, they're helpful for you as an end user, but if you do run into an error with syncing, the sync status information can help our EndNote support team identify what particular trouble you're running into with your sync that might be holding up an incomplete sync from taking place. So they can be really helpful here. And it's just gone into a busy state here. It's just going to give it a moment. I might close the application and relaunch it, but let's give it a moment. Since this is a fresh sync, it might just be busy thinking behind the scenes here. Yep, there we go. Perfect. It's come back to life. So if we go to sync status now, just to confirm, we see the sync details. Lets me know last time I ran the sync. If there was an error, it would let me know the error code. Again, that can be helpful for our product support team. And I can confirm that all references, groups, and attachments have been synced between my local library and my online library. If there were differences in these counts, that might let me know an incomplete sync is taking place, perhaps due to a corrupt PDF or something like that. And again, that's information our product support team would be handy to know to help them troubleshoot your syncing issue further. And just going back to preferences to round out that sync tab, I just wanted to confirm, we now see that I've got a field called Sync This EndNote Library that helps me confirm which library I've designated as my sync library. This is the only library that's going to be synchronized with EndNote Online. And this optional box, checked by default, sync automatically, will instruct EndNote to sync when you launch the application, once every 15 minutes while the application is running, and when you close the application. If you turn this off and you click OK, EndNote is only going to sync, when you go to the library menu and you click the sync command, or if you go to sync status and you click sync now. Again, if you turn sync automatically off, that's how you would invoke the sync to take place manually otherwise. A couple of tabs remaining here we're just going to quickly run through. We had talked a little bit about temporary citations. Those are those, if I just convert my document again to unformatted citations, these are these bracketed placeholders which serve as, they're temporary citations. They serve as placeholders until EndNote formats those references. You would normally want your temporary citations to be surrounded by a delimiter that you're not using elsewhere in your document. Typically curly braces or curly brackets or French braces, as we refer to them, go unused. This is the default temporary citation delimiter. But if you use those for equations or you know, anything else, that can be problematic for EndNote, because let's say I had a note or an equation using that same delimiter. If I go ahead and, excuse me, I've got the preferences window open. Let me close that. If I go format, again, this document with this text surrounded by the curly brackets, EndNote's going to stop on it and say, well, I can't find this citation in your library. Which reference is this? And I can use the select matching reference window to try to find the correct reference. In this case, this isn't a reference. So in this scenario, I would actually want to click ignore to allow EndNote to finish formatting the document. If I wanted to, if I've got, again, any instances of where I use the default delimiter for non-citation text in my document, and I want to avoid the select matching reference window that we just saw pop up, I could, you know, temporarily use a different bracket for my non-citation notes. I can use square brackets, let's say. EndNote isn't set to look at that, look for that by default, and we'd see that this time around. EndNote doesn't even stop on that text because EndNote knows that it's not related to a citation because it's not surrounded by the curly brackets. But if you're using, let's just unformat one more time. Let's say you are using no, actually, let's format once more. If you are using the, let's say the curly braces and you can't change those, that's when you can tweak what EndNote is set to look for. So if we return back to the preferences window once more, to the temporary citations tab, the temp citation delimiters, maybe we want those to be square brackets. Usually those are a little bit more common than curly braces, but if you're not using square brackets and you are using curly braces for non-citation text, this may be helpful. I can go back to my document here. If I go run update citations in bibliography and unformat once more, we see my existing citations are now surrounded by square brackets instead. And again, just to confirm, because I've changed my temporary citation delimiter to look for square brackets, EndNote is not going to stop on this curly bracketed text again, because that's not the designated delimiter. So hope that helps. In most cases, you won't need to change the delimiter, but again, if you are using the curly brackets, the default delimiter as some other non-citation element in your document, that might be an instance where you want to change those temporary citation delimiters to some other bracket that you're not using or other delimiter that you're not using elsewhere. Just quickly to show you here, if I unformat once more, as I was mentioning, each of your temporary citations usually has the first author's surname, the year, and the record number. If for whatever reason you want your record number to be identified with some other marker other than the hashtag or pound symbol, you can change that here. I can't really say there are many instances where that's beneficial, but if you did want some control over that that aspect of the temporary citation format, you have the ability to tweak that here under reference number marker. If you want to use something other than record number as an identifier for your temporary citations, you can check this box here. You can choose label instead. You know, if you have, like I was mentioning, maybe a unique identifier in your label field in each one of your EndNote libraries, and you want to use that as your temporary citation identifier instead of the record number, you can choose to do that. Instead of label, you also have the choice to choose a session number or pages. You've got the ability to tweak your temporary citation in that format. I'm going to keep this turned off. Again, it's a nice power feature, but there are not many instances where I would say that this is a requirement to change. It can be beneficial depending on your workflows, but I wouldn't necessarily say you have to come here and automatically change this for any reason. We see that we've got the temporary, the citation prefix marker. This is what it would look like when you add a plain text prefix to your in-text citations. I just want to show you how you would normally do this in Word. If I go ahead and reformat my document again, perfect. I can, instead of manually adding a prefix to my temporary citation, I would say it's usually easier to select your formatted citation, go to Edit and Manage Citations. Right here on this window, we have a field called Prefix, and I can add something like, you know, the phrase "see also" or something like that as a prefix text, which would just be text that appears at the beginning of the parenthetical citation. If I click OK, we see that that gets added automatically. I don't have to do anything special in terms of formatting. If I now unformat my document one more time, convert to unformatted citations, perfect. We see that in my temporary citation, this is how my prefix text is defined. So if I didn't use Edit and Manage Citations, if I just wanted to do that from scratch by modifying my temporary citation with the default settings, I would just add my prefix text at the beginning of the parenthetical, the bracketed temporary citation, and I would add a backslash before the author surname. If I wanted to use a different character, as we saw on the temporary citation tab, I can define a different character if I wanted to. Again, not many instances where I would say you need to change this to something else, but it's nice to know that you have the ability to do so here on the preferences window. The last part of this particular tab that I wanted to touch on is how you can add note references. This is something strictly for numbered styles. This is something that would not come into play for author date or author year citation styles like we've been using today. But if I go ahead and click OK here and go back to my document, I'm going to reformat with a numbered style temporarily. Let's use Vancouver as a test here. I'm going to just select that style. We see that my document, if I run update citations in bibliography, gets reformatted. Oh, let's take out this prefix. Usually you're not going to have a prefix in a numbered style there. Perfect. All right, there we go. So if I wanted to add a note to my document for a numbered style, I could, there's a couple of ways you could do this. I could use the insert citation drop-down, where I can select insert note, and then I've got this free text field. I can, see also, I'm just adding a note to this example here. And if I click OK, we see that for a numbered style, that note gets assigned a number in the text, and then it becomes a part of the numbered bibliography at the end. And just to reiterate, this won't apply to a numbered style. An author date style. You'll see your note in the text, but it would not be part of the bibliography because it's not a numbered sort order. Again, this will only apply, the insert note feature will only apply to numbered styles like Vancouver or numbered, things like that. Now I can, instead of using insert note, as you saw in the temporary citations tab, I could add a temporary citation myself. I'm still using the square brackets for now here, but if I go ahead and define, a Word document has locked up temporarily here. Let's see what's going on. There we go. Okay, perfect. No. It's unformatted. Actually, let me close Word, and I'm just going to reopen this document. Not sure what the trouble was in Word there, but if I go ahead and just open that one more time. Perfect. Okay, so just sort of starting from scratch here, instead of using insert note like we just looked at for a numbered style, I could also use a plain text temporary citation for this. So if I go ahead and say note, colon, this is the default setting, I could say, see also Jones 2015 period, and then closing bracket. I can define this manually, and we see that instant formatting just kicked in and turned that into a formatted citation. It's hard to tell. It was just at the end of the body of text, and this is the start of the bibliography as well. So this is not a format that not everyone needs to use, even if you're applying a numbered style to your formatted reference list. But if you do need to add, note references to your bibliography, you can do so using either insert note automatically through Cite While You Write, or you can manually create a temporary citation containing this note label. And if for whatever reason you want to change that to something else, you have the ability to do so here. But I would say usually, note, all capitalized with a colon, we usually do the trick. Not too many instances where you might need to change that. So finally, we've got the terms list tab. Again, this I was mentioning, term lists is worthy of a lesson of its own, and it's basically an element of your EndNote library, where EndNote will look at a field or a series of fields to take note of the terms that you add to that particular field in your EndNote library, so that EndNote can suggest that term going forward. So just as an example here in my sample library, if I go to references and I choose new reference, each library that you create by default has an author term list, a year, journals term list, and a keywords term list. So if I go to type into the author field here, we can see that EndNote is automatically suggesting names that exist in my EndNote library based off of that term list. If I enter a name that has not been used before, it will show up in red to let me know that that's the first time this term appears in this particular library. Red doesn't mean wrong per se. It might let me know I've got a typo if I know that I do have another reference from that same author elsewhere in this library, or it might let me know that I'm using an alternate naming convention. Maybe in one entry I have a full name, the other entry I've got the person's abbreviated name, just their initials. That can negatively impact EndNote's ability to format these references. So again, red doesn't mean wrong, but essentially the term lists just allow you to populate a list of terms so that you can quickly, as you're seeing here in keywords, quickly input a term going forward. It can help to reduce errors, especially spelling errors, things like that, that might impact your project going forward if there's typos, things like that. But by default, if I just close this record and save the change and return to the preferences window, by default, we can see that I've got an option to suggest terms as you type. That's what we saw in action when I was entering author names. If for some reason I didn't want that to occur, maybe I still want my term list to populate, but I don't want EndNote to suggest terms as I type. I could turn that off here. And in terms of the lists being populated, we see that by default. If I'm importing references from a text file or direct exporting from a website, or I'm pasting references from one library to another, EndNote will take note of the terms in those fields and update the appropriate lists accordingly. And the same goes for data entry. If I'm just manually inputting reference information like I just was a moment ago, if I want EndNote to take note of terms that I'm adding through manual data entry, I would want to leave this option checked as well. So all of these are turned on by default, but you have full control over whether or not EndNote is suggesting terms as you type with this setting here, and how you're populating those term lists automatically. If you don't want EndNote to automatically update this list, deselect both of these options. But if you're okay with EndNote taking note of these terms as you build your library, I would leave these options turned on by default. Now, the last tab to touch on here before we wrap is the URLs and links tab. A couple of settings here. Like I mentioned, there's what's called the connection log file that records communication between EndNote and a remote database to try to get information about, like, if there's an error connecting to a remote database via online search, that connect log file might have some information. Or if data is coming in incorrectly, from that connect log file, we can actually look at the underlying information to see if maybe the connection file in EndNote needs to be updated. Now, we see that this is the default path here on Windows, and I'm going to navigate to it in just a moment. But under your user account, there's a folder called App Data, another folder called Roaming, an EndNote folder here, and that's where you would have the connect.log file. On Mac OS, excuse me, it's similar path, a little bit different. It's under your what's called your home folder. There's a library subfolder, an application support folder, then your EndNote folder, and this connection log file. Now, this is a fresh EndNote installation, so this doesn't exist just yet. But if I click OK, and let's say I want to quickly do an online search, let's maybe use a Library of Congress as an example here. I can search for a topic. Let's maybe we'll just search for jazz, let's say. And if I go and search on that, and EndNote is querying this remote database, Library of Congress. If any references are indexed by this remote database, they'll come into this temporary space where I can review the resources before I add anything to my EndNote library. With EndNote 20, if there are up to 25 search results found, they'll be downloaded automatically in this temporary space. And afterward, I can expand my number of search results further. I could download, 25, 50, 75, 100, or the complete range. If I've got hundreds or thousands of results, I can download all of this temporary search results here in this temporary search space to review them. I just want to let this finish before we take a look at that underlying connect log file, because otherwise I won't be able to open the file since it's in use. But we see that it's almost done here. And again, none of these are yet in my library. They're just in this temporary search space under online search here. Perfect. So that's just finished. If I wanted to expand my list of references, I could, like I mentioned. But now if I open up I've got this folder open already behind the scenes. But just to confirm, under my user folder, that's my specific user folder, App Data, Roaming EndNote, I've got various preferences here related to the EndNote installation. But it's this connect.log file that just got created. And if I open that with a text editor, we can actually see the communication from EndNote to the remote database. Like I mentioned, if there was some sort of error, sometimes the connect log file will let us know. That will clue us in as to why EndNote's not establishing a connection successfully. And we can also see the raw data that's being transmitted by that remote database, so that if for some reason some information is coming in incorrectly, there may be some trouble with how we've got the data laid out in the connection file, or maybe they've tweaked the format of their data and we need to update the connection file. So not much for an average end user to do here, but I did just want to point out the purpose of this connect log file, or it's on macOS it's called connection.log. But basically this file just communicates records communication between EndNote and a remote database, and details that communication to help clue us in for possible data entry issues or connectivity issues, things like that. ISI-based URL is a legacy setting that really doesn't come into play any longer. Years ago, if you were at an institution that subscribes to Web of Science, you could theoretically host a local version of that Web of Science data on your local domain. And if that was the case, and you wanted Web of Science links in EndNote to point to that local version of Web of Science instead of the primary Web of Science site, you can change this URL to your local instance of Web of Science on your local domain instead of pointing to the primary site. Again, this really doesn't come into play any longer with Web of Science subscriptions, but it's a sort of keep backwards compatibility with preferences. It is still part of the preferences window here. So really nothing to change here. And if you are using that, like I mentioned, that open URL technology, if you're at an institution that maintains an open URL server, the arguments basically construct the syntax of the URL that gets generated through that query. Now, these are the defaults. Usually, you don't have much control over what these arguments look like. Your open URL provider would tell you what you would need if you needed to make changes here, what those changes would need to look like. But typically, for open URL servers, the default arguments are perfectly fine. So again, not much to change here in that regard. Now, the last setting before we wrap our lesson plan for the day is this optional checkbox here. It's checked by default. It's called copy new file attachments to the default file attachment folder and create a relative link. To see this in action, I actually want to close the sample library for a moment and open up a library that I've got on my desktop just for this part of the lesson here. So I've gone to Open Library. I'm choosing a new blank library that's right on my desktop. Just to keep things streamlined, I'm now going to go and close the sample library here, excuse me, so that I just have the one library open. And now if I go ahead and just, I'm going to go ahead and add a reference to this EndNote library just as an example here. We'll go ahead and just use PubMed as a example search. Again, I've got a connection error here. Let's see why. Okay, let's actually, I'm just going to go ahead and import the text file that we had used a little bit earlier in the class, just to, again, due to time constraints. I'm just going to go ahead and import tagged text file. This time we'll use the RIS file, actually. And when you're importing RIS formatted data, you would use the Reference Manager RIS import option. If I click import here, this should just take a moment to finish. Perfect. Okay. So let's cancel that. Perfect. So we see in this new library that I just created, I actually imported a text file containing 1,527 references. None of these have file attachments just yet. So if I, just as an example, if I go select one of these entries in the library and I go to attach file, this is a workflow that we walked through just a bit ago. I'm going to go and just select a PDF, that same PDF from the downloads folder here, and choose open. We see that EndNote has renamed it as expected, and with the relative link, that default setting of creating a relative link, what happens is EndNote copies the original file. So in this case, EndNote has copied this PDF from my downloads folder, and EndNote puts the version of the PDF that EndNote accesses within my library's data folder. So this example library that we're looking at right now is right on my desktop for ease of access. Each EndNote library is comprised of an ENL file and a data folder. The data folder is really the warehouse where all of the library information is stored. Any file attachments that you link relatively will be stored in this data folder. So we see I've got a PDF subfolder. I've got a serialized entry folder in there, and we see the PDF that EndNote is linking to my EndNote library record is stored here. Relative links are handy because if you want to move your library from one computer to another, all of the relative links will be valid. So that way, again, if you turn that off, if you turn relative linking off, if I go back to preferences here and I uncheck this box, what would happen is that EndNote would, instead of copying the file and placing it in your library's data folder, EndNote would just make a pointer to that original file on your hard drive. So just as an example, if I select another entry in my library and I go to attach file, I'll go ahead and choose just another PDF here in my downloads folder. There we go. So we see this one wasn't renamed because, again, EndNote is just making a pointer to this file. If I go and save that change, just to reiterate, if I go back to my data folder related to the sample library and I go open the PDF, we don't see another folder in here because that second file that I just linked is an absolute link, like I mentioned. It's just a pointer to that original file. If I hover my mouse over this item, we see that the tooltip points to just that original file under downloads. This is nice in the sense that it gives you control over your structure, your file attachment structure on your hard drive. But if you've got absolute links for files linked to your library, your EndNote library, unless you can recreate those file links exactly on another computer, all of those links will be broken if you move your library from one computer to another. So if you do want to have absolute links, I usually, whether it be Windows or Mac OS, I usually recommend linking your PDFs or whatever files they are on a folder directly on the root of the hard drive. That way, that would be a path that would be easily recreated on a destination computer versus the path that we saw here in this example. If I used absolute links and I wanted to move my library from one computer to another, the only way that this file would be active on the destination computer is if I could make a folder on the C drive under users with my existing employee ID. I'd basically have to recreate this exact path on my destination computer for an absolute link to be valid. Whereas relative links, that's not a requirement. All of your entries are stored within the library itself, and as long as you move that data folder over as part of the library transfer process, all of your file attachments will be valid. The last thing I wanted to mention is if you do decide to turn off relative linking and you use find full text, the files that EndNote finds via PDF files that EndNote finds via find full text will always be linked relatively. Those find full text PDFs will always be stored in your EndNote library's data folder. Those will not be absolute links. And if you want to use EndNote Sync and you want to synchronize your file attachments from one computer to another, those have to be relative links. If you've turned this off and you've got absolute links, even if you've configured the sync feature, your file attachments will not be uploaded to EndNote online if they're absolutely linked. Only if they're relatively linked would those attachments be included as part of the syncing process.